Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 5 of season 3 of Strange New Worlds, called Through the Lens of Time. And when I heard that title, I thought it's going to involve time travel, but apparently not. It's all about archaeology. And as usual in New Trek, they're always ripping off other movies and other shows, and so this time they mostly rip off Indiana Jones, as well as the sci-fi horror movie Event Horizon. There's a lot of similar stuff from that movie, and also some similarities to the horror movie Cube, and also a little bit of Tenet. And so as usual, they're not really making up anything new of their own, they're only imitating and copying things from other movies. Now, at least it did have some similarities to all kinds of Star Trek episodes, and so it also makes it feel a little bit Star Trek-ish, but it's still the same problem that it's the same idea, and also it's now a continuity mistake because it makes no sense if this is supposed to be a prequel. How come the characters were not aware of all of this stuff in the events that happened later? Because in the TOS episode, The Return to Tomorrow, they encounter something really similar to what we saw in this episode, and yet Spock, who witnessed the events of this episode of the prequel, he didn't seem to mention that, it reminds me of something I encountered a few years ago, maybe we should be more careful because it ended badly in the previous time we encountered something like this. Yet he doesn't say anything like that, and he volunteered his own body to those energy beings inside the orbs, even though the ones we see in this episode turned out to be evil. Another continuity mistake is with TNG because someone loses his eyes in this episode, and in TNG, Geordi was surprised to find out that he can be given new eyes by Dr. Pulaski, so it sounded as if it was something brand new that Pulaski said, I've done it twice and it's not guaranteed, it's a risk. And Geordi said, but I was told that's impossible, and so he was surprised to find out that now it is possible to use the replicators to give him new eyes and all of that, and yet in this show, they casually mentioned how they can grow new eyes to that ensign, like it's a normal casual thing, just like Ortega got her fingers back magically somehow, and they didn't say it's synthetic fingers or something, so they apparently are able to grow new organs for people in this show, which is set 100 years before the other Star Trek shows in which they couldn't do that. Even Martok in Deep Space Nine, Bashir offered to implant an artificial eye for him and he refused. So if it's the same as an organic eye in every way, why exactly did he refuse? So it sounded as if he didn't want an artificial robotic eye instead of his real one. And when Nog got his leg replaced, they said that it's a synthetic leg, something like that. So it was not fully organic, so they never really went into the details, so I guess we can make up excuses and find a wiggle room, but how come Geordi was so surprised when Pulaski told him it's now possible to give him new eyes, and so it was apparently possible a century before that. Also in Star Trek Discovery we saw some guy who was always wearing what appeared to be a more primitive visor, and so if it's possible to grow new eyes, why didn't they do that in Discovery? And the first half of the episode was pretty boring. It starts off as a soap opera with all the characters, so Dr. Corby, who is an archaeologist, is on the ship, and Spock knows him so well for more than just one episode, and so how come when they encountered him again in TOS, Spock couldn't recognize his voice? Also, it's funny how Corby was surprised to find out that Christine was on the Enterprise, and yet he knows her while she's on the Enterprise already in this show, and so it doesn't really fit. And also there's a scene when we see a map of the galaxy, and we see on the border with the Klingon Empire the planet Triple Prime. And that, I think, is a continuity mistake with the scene in Deep Space Nine in which Worf said that the Klingon Empire sent out hundreds of warriors to track down the Tribbles to their homeworld in order to send an armada to destroy it. And so why did they need to track it down if it's right there on the map? Everyone knows where the Tribble homeworld is, and so why exactly did Worf say that the Klingons had to track them down to destroy their planet? And so it's once again a continuity mistake. And there's a scene when Christine and Spock are in the turbolift together, and they do have the handles of the turbolift like in TOS, but they don't seem to need to hold them like in TOS, so that's another kind of continuity issue. And they have like an awkward conversation, and then Ensign Laforgery comes in and interrupts them, and now it's an awkward silence, and that is a scene which I think is straight out of the Orville. We had something very similar to that. And the Orville itself is also kind of guilty of ripping off older things, namely from the old Star Trek shows. But at least the Orville always added something to it. At least the Orville at least made some kind of twist on it and turned it into a parody, made a funnier version of the same ideas, or at least tried to make it better. And it didn't always work. I also complained about the Orville in many episodes, but most of the time at least they added something to it. And we also have Ortega's brother, who is making a documentary for Starfleet, and he has all these flying drones filming everyone all the time. Why don't they always take these camera drones with them everywhere so they can scan dangerous places before they go in? And so only now when a journalist is with them, suddenly they have this technology. Otherwise they wouldn't have these kind of camera drones, and so that's kind of funny. It also reminds me of the movie Prometheus, when they went into all kinds of ancient temples and they sent out flying drones to scan everything in front of them. So there's something similar to that in this episode when they go into this Indiana Jones kind of Temple of Doom, which is carved inside of a mountain, and Christine sticks her finger in the wall, which takes her blood, and then the doors open and they come in. And when they find the dead bodies of all kinds of other aliens, Spock wants to leave the chamber to report to the ship, but then they don't let him. Christine doesn't let him do it, even though they can literally just step out a few meters out of the door to contact the ship to ask Pike for what he wants to do, but no one else except Spock wants to do that. Everyone shuts Spock down, even though he's the senior officer, and they say, no, let's continue the mission anyway. But you literally have to step a few meters out of the door to contact the ship, because they cannot do it from the inside, and then they won't let Spock do it, and then he just accepts it. And then later, of course, they get trapped inside there, and then Ensign Laforgery picks off some glowing globe and sticks it to his face, and then it explodes, and his eyes are gone. And then they do go outside and beam him back to the ship, where M'Benga treats him by putting a visor on him, which is supposed to grow back his eyes. So Geordi a century later is unaware that it's possible. And even in Star Trek Picard, which is taking place decades later, they still couldn't do that. Because remember all those ex-Borg drones that we saw in season 1 of Picard, who had missing eyes and missing hands, and they couldn't simply fix them up. They couldn't grow new eyes for them. And so how come it apparently was possible a century before? And as usual in the show, there's a bunch of scenes in this episode of women overpowering men. Christine suddenly takes charge of the mission even though Spock outranks her, but Christine was given command of the mission, and so she's the one making all the decisions. And also that Temple of Doom place considers her the leader of the group because she's the one who gave her blood to it to open the doors in the beginning, and it kind of scanned her. She's the key to everything. They literally say it in the episode. And so Spock's opinions are disregarded, and Uhura is shown to be much more courageous than Ortega's brother. And on the ship itself also there's a bunch of scenes when Nat Guinan keeps cutting Pike off. Pike is starting to talk, and then she cuts him off and says something to contradict him, and then he just sits quietly and doesn't answer. Isn't he the captain of the ship? Why is an officer under his command constantly cuts off the captain and contradicts him, and then he doesn't do anything about it? And there was at least 2 scenes like that in this episode. When she cuts him off and talks over him, and also she does that to Scotty at one point. Scotty begins to explain something, and then she suddenly cuts him off and explains things better than him. And then in the very end also, when Pike starts talking about good and evil, and she cuts him off and says, no, there is such a thing as pure evil. And he just sits quietly and accepts all these constant interruptions by her. It was also funny to me how brutally honest M'Benga was with his patient. It was almost as if he wanted to scare him. Like he described to him things so graphically. He said, your eyes flew out of their sockets. And later he said to him, your brain is dead, which I think might be a reference to that episode Spock's Brain, when McCoy said his brain is gone. And so M'Benga keeps saying things to him which are so scary, and then that guy starts panicking, and then he has to sedate him. And meanwhile on the planet they are stuck inside that temple, and it appears to have like an infinite amount of chambers which are all identical in all directions. That kind of reminded me of the movie Cube, and there's also all kinds of traps that kill people. And they reveal in the end of this episode that actually it's all in the same room, but it's kind of split off into other realities, and so it's a layered dimensional space, and they use all kinds of strange technobabble which makes no sense. So quantum something, and it also reminds me of the previous episode when they tried to make a parody of TOS, and they kind of deliberately used bad technobabble, and there was a place when they said, we cannot survive without our brain cells, we need it for many science things. It's funny how that parody is actually more fitting to their own show, because they have bad technobabble, and they have a guy missing his brain now in this episode. And then we start getting all kinds of evil vibes from Laforgery, which immediately reminded me of the movie Event Horizon, in which one of the characters turned evil toward the end, and he was also missing his eyes, and he was talking about beings from other dimensions, kind of possessing people and all of that. So that's something similar in this episode, because that orb in the beginning, which contains some energy entity, basically went into Laforgery and is kind of controlling him, but not all the time. So it's like a split personality thing. So one moment he's normal, another moment he starts getting evil. It also kind of reminded me of Gary Mitchell from TOS, who kind of gained superpowers from some phenomenon and then started getting creepy and evil in a kind of gradual way. And so we start getting kind of glimpses of the evil nature of this being inside Laforgery. Suddenly he somehow knows about Mabenga's daughter. So is it by telepathy? Is he reading the minds and memories of other people? They never actually explain how he knows the things he's not supposed to know. He knows something about the dead mother of one of the guards, and then he is able to lure him toward him, and then he kills him through the force field somehow. And that also kind of reminded me of a scene in Deep Space Nine when Sisko was possessed by some previous host of Jadzia who was a psycho, and he was starting to talk in an evil way and then broke out of his holding cell and stuff like that. So there are some similarities to previous Star Trek shows as well, about all kinds of aliens trying to possess the crew, and there was an episode like that in TNG as well, when those blue entities took over Data and Troy and O'Brien, then they tried to release all the other ones to take over the entire crew. So that's also a similar idea, because in this episode they find out there are thousands of these ancient beings trapped inside that place, which is basically like a prison for them. And they explain that whoever built that place was trying to gain immortality by some quantum something, and that accidentally opened the doors for these beings from another dimension, which are trying to take over people. So basically demons, kind of like in Event Horizon, when that spaceship traveled to another dimension and came back, but some demons came with it from hell or something like that. And the main one who took over that doctor character also took his own eyes out and still seeing things without his eyes. And that is also the case here when Ensign Laforgery seemed to be able to see even without the eyes, because he's running through the ship and attacking people, and his lack of eyes is not a problem for him somehow. They never really explained it. I guess it's telepathy. And we also have a scene when Captain Batel comes into sickbay and sees Laforgery and suddenly starts fighting with him, as if her instinct somehow knows he's possessed by an evil entity, which I guess the Gorn encountered before, and somehow she knows about it from genetic memory. They never actually explain any of this. She just starts fighting with him for some reason, and he strangles her and throws her away. So a bunch of similar scenes to Event Horizon. And eventually they just kill Laforgery, and then the evil demon thing comes out of it, and then Scotty simply traps it inside one of those orbs and then beams it into the transporter buffer, where they will keep it imprisoned forever. Which is kind of dangerous. Why keep it on the ship at all? Why not simply beam that orb thing back to the temple or out into space or hide it somewhere? Why keep it inside the computer system of the ship, unless they want to keep it for a potential sequel episode? But what annoys me most about all of it is it now makes no sense when in TOS Spock encounters Sargon, who is also an energy being trapped inside the sphere, and he doesn't seem worried at all about it. After he knows that such entities can take over people and are really evil, how come when they encounter Sargon and all those other orbs with entities in them, and then Sargon and his friends want to take them over, Spock seems to be not worried at all about it. Actually, he volunteers his own body for those entities, because they promise them they're only going to lend their bodies because they want to build robot bodies for themselves, so they only need their bodies temporarily. And then Spock never even once mentions, we encountered something similar a few years ago when the ship was under the command of Pike, and those entities seem to be kind of evil. And one of them took over Ensign Laforgery, and he said a lot of evil, nasty things. And so I don't think it's a good idea to lend our bodies to these kinds of energy creatures trapped inside orbs. And yet he never said any of that in that episode of TOS. And so it makes no sense now. If you look at this episode and then go to TOS, how come Spock is so calm and not at all worried? Does he lose his memory at some point after the end of this show, that he doesn't seem to remember anything by the time of TOS? Because he forgot all about Roger Corby, he forgot about being in love with Christine in the past, and he forgot all about dating the granddaughter of Noonien Singh, because when he meets Khan in TOS, How come he didn't tell Khan, oh, I used to date your great-granddaughter a few years ago, and she had your last name for some reason, even though she complained about other kids making fun of her as a child because she had the last name of a mass murderer from the past, and yet she didn't bother to actually change her last name. So none of this makes any sense if we actually think about it. So anyway, they're trapped inside the Temple of Doom on the planet, and Spock suddenly notices an injury on his hand that he doesn't remember getting, and it seems to be healing by itself. And so it's kind of like in Tenet, which had a similar scene of the main guy getting an injury which heals backwards. And that's what gives him the idea that they should make a leap of faith to get out of there, because that door suddenly had the bridge to it disappear, and they couldn't get to the door to get outside of the temple. And then Spock tells them they have to make a leap of faith, and the bridge would reappear if they step on it. So, and they all have to do it simultaneously. They all have to decide to do it for the bridge to appear. And so it's exactly like that scene in Indiana Jones. And also Dr. Corby wants to take one of the artifacts back with him, and Christine has to tell him, no, you have to leave it behind. If you take it, we'll be unable to leave. So that's also straight out of Indiana Jones. And so in a way it is kind of entertaining to me simply to pick up on all this kind of stuff. But as a viewer, is it really fun to watch a show which is completely devoid of originality, which is just imitating other movies, and they're not improving upon it, because nothing about any of it looks better or is a parody or a funnier version of the same kind of ideas. They're simply making like a cheap, lazy copy of the same ideas we saw before. So some people will say it's a homage, it's fine to do it, fine, it's fine to do a homage, but when the entire episode is completely made up of all these homages from all kinds of other movies, then there is no originality or imagination or anything new at all about any of this. If they had improved the same idea and made it better, then I wouldn't have such a big problem with it. I would still say it's not really original, but at least I will admit, it's an improved version of the same idea, so maybe it's a good thing to do, kind of a good remake of something, just like, the Orville did in many episodes, in which they did take a lot of older ideas, but at least they did it in a newer, better way in some places, not always. So if they do that kind of remake, which is actually an improvement, then maybe it would even be a good thing. But with these writers and these producers and the way they do things carelessly and not really creative or inventive or imaginative, and they just rip off other things and make a cheaper, lesser version of it, then what's the point of doing that at all? So that's my biggest problem. So that's all I have to say about it for today. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.